I tweeted this on January 10th. I've yet to encounter anyone who has been able to establish transgenderism as an unequivocal moral good. Twitter user 1984 is now responded to me. A result of the myth that all self-expression is good self-expression. Negative consequences must then be quote-unquote tolerated. On a very technical level, what I do on this program is self-expression. I'm expressing ideas, and they come from myself. But that's about where the similarities end. Because if what I were saying were said by anybody else, it would still hold true. It would still mean the same thing. But what if we aren't expressing ideas? Ideas aren't the only thing that can be expressed. Fine. You want to express your identity. What makes your identity good in and of itself? Enter identity politics. I am, therefore I'm great. And that is the plurality of what you're dealing with out there. Not a majority, but an alarming number of people. With that being said, welcome to Common Filth Radio. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, visit us at commonfilthradio.bandcamp.com. Links below. $2 or more gets you Common Filth Radio, the best of 2014. The #1 social commentary album on Bandcamp. A tag that is related to social justice, which I'm sure will cause some rewrites in the Bandcamp terms of service policy. I brought up self-expression at the beginning of this episode because I'm noticing an alarming number of people that internalize self-expression as this good thing that cannot be questioned. And people don't question that idea. And it's become a very disturbing part of culture that seems to go unnoticed by most people. The catalyst for what got me thinking about this was this screenshot and the reaction that I got from it. I posted this to the Facebook page for Tumblristas. This screenshot says, "I am so proud of my country. A trans actress called Saga Becker just got nominated for a Swedish Movie Award, Best Female Lead, from Sweden. Big fucking shock, right?" So I posted this, left it for some hours or some amount of days, and went back and read the comments for it. I saw a comment that said something along the lines of, "Wait, I thought we supported this. I thought we supported the abolition of gender roles." Really, sex roles. Gender is a Marxist word. We don't use that word. And I thought to myself, how the fuck do you rationalize having this worldview and liking this page? The anti-SJW crowd seems to be just the same as those they are against. Because they see social justice warriors and their extreme rhetoric as an enemy to the enlightened progressive society that everyone's apparently dreaming of. Initially, I thought to myself, this is my fault. This is my fault for attracting these kinds of people. Because there were few reactions. There were more than one. There were more than one responses along these lines. That, "Oh, I thought we were for this. Yeah, why aren't we for this? I'm sick of all the reactionary bullshit on these pages." Stuff like that. But after some time, I realized this is not my fault. I am showing affronts to human decency, and there's no better place to do it than Tumblr. I show you the most depraved shit, and you react to it how you want to. That tells me who you are. The people who reacted in such a way to this screenshot about the Swedish trans actor tells me that they value self-expression above all else, and that SJWs are somehow enemies of self-expression when they're the best at it, if we're going by the book. As we've established, and nobody has been able to disprove me on this, usually people that want to undergo these drastic changes with their bodies and inject all these sorts of foreign hormones into their bodies, it usually is born out of a fetishization of the opposite sex, usually brought on by some distance from the opposite sex. So right there, this form of self-expression is null and void of any sort of moral high ground. Because it is sexual in nature. It is animal in nature. It is not transcendent. It is not noble. It is not self-sacrificing. It is not God-glorifying. It is not nation-glorifying. It's just rearranging parts for the sake of rearranging them. I've established in previous episodes, but I will reiterate that being an interchangeable part, being an androgynous, fungible thing, is horrible because it turns you into a commodity that can be, well, this isn't working so well anymore. Let's change it out. No loyalty to anything. The realization has hit me that the plurality of people want this for the sake of self-expression, which is basically a code word for, well, I don't want that person's feelings to get hurt. This person who clearly needs some help. The common man is so myopic and solipsistic that this is what they value. Expressing themselves. That 3-year-old throwing a temper tantrum because they have to go to bed or they can't watch TV. They're expressing themselves. So I guess we should start tagging our posts on Tumblr with adult privilege now, because that kid's feelings are hurt. It's like, goddamn, you think our elites are bad? Look at those doing their bidding, willfully, with a smile on their face. But we get it. Self-expression as something that is good in and of itself is a very stupid idea. The more intriguing thread to this storyline is the blurry line between anti-SJW and SJW. This line started to blur during the peak of Gamergate when the anti-Gamergate people, the pro-feminist people were all like, oh, Gamergate's a white cis hate group. Gamergate countered with, look at all our people on the political compass. They're all left libertarians. Look how much diversity we have. Right there. You've accepted their premises. And that's why I don't consider myself a part of this. Never have. Even though I have my sympathies. I take seriously what they've done to Gawker, costing them a couple $1 million. On the other hand, Intel giving Feminist Frequency $30 million, it goes to show you how much work we have to do with regards to dismantling the synagogue. But Gamergate's only a small part of it, this lack of divide between anti-SJW and SJW. Because what am I going to expect from uncurious people who just want to be left alone to play their video? The divide between anti-social justice warriors and social justice warriors themselves is fundamentally this. The anti-SJW crowd, they're leftists that believe all this degenerate civilization ruining shit. But they don't like the fact that SJWs make them look bad. In other words, anti-SJW is still pro-social justice. They still believe in correcting historical wrongs. They believe in the narrative of the oppressor and the oppressed. They believe in sexual deviancy. They believe that self-expression is a good thing because the self is good. People are fundamentally good. I've talked about this before, but I don't think I made it clear enough, and I think this makes it clear. This makes clear the slight divisions that exist. In a way, I am pro-SJW because they give me material to work with and because they make the left look completely ridiculous. So Gamergate prides itself on being libertarian or whatever, but that's not something I've talked about much, libertarianism. And I will tell you why I am no longer a libertarian. I was back in like '06 when I was a teenager that didn't know shit, that thought people were still good and that self-expression was a good thing and all of this other nonsense that kids generally believe in should grow out of, but a lot of people, they don't grow. In talking about this, I'm going to use Stefan Molyneux as a reference point, because he's somebody I encountered earlier on in my development, and somebody who I've started watching again in recent months, and I enjoy what he has to say, but the problem with him is that he reiterates constantly, we want the free society, we want a free and open society, and that's the greatest thing to him. If you have listened to the show long enough, I think I've convincingly laid out the case for the fact that the common man is not fit to look after a goldfish, let alone his own destiny. The slob proles spend their money on the stupidest shit. They have children out of wedlock. They get divorced, get into relationships that will never work out. The common idiot cannot handle the most simple of things. They can't say to themselves, you know what, I'm not going to stick my dick in that girl. I'm not going to stick my dick in her because I'm not ready to raise a child. Or, I'm not going to stick my dick in this person I hardly know and trust. Because, well, what if we do have a kid? Well, we could put that kid up for adoption. That would be the sane, sound thing to do in that case. But people sleep around with untrustworthy people. People get knocked up. The lady says, oh, I want the kid because this kid means more EBT money. If they're lucky, if these girls are lucky, they get reality TV programs based off of them. And even if they aren't that lucky, they'll still get child support for however many years they get it. But we already know that. The fundamental point is that people do not make good decisions. The vast majority of people, including my own existence, are a result of bad decisions. But not everybody is perfect, I understand this. Everybody has a slip up every once in a while. Even if they are so detailed in what they do, in their behavior and their conduct, they're still bound to have mistakes. But even still, how many people learn from their mistakes? Learn positive things from their mistakes? Because a lot of people do learn from their mistakes. But you know what they learn? They learn what crippling regret and depression feel like. And that's what the smarter people get who are capable of some introspection. It's funny, I watched that Louis Theroux documentary about the Westboro Baptist Church, and he was interviewing some guy who's like, oh, I was into libertarianism, and then I found the Westboro Baptist Church, and I watched it. I'm like, gosh, I hope I never end up like that guy when I first watched the documentary, and now I am that guy. But I appreciate the intellectual honesty that libertarians like Stefan Molyneux seem to adhere themselves to, because they are socially liberal, yet they're also economically liberal. And in the classical sense, not in the regulatory sense, in the union sense. And the fact that economic liberalism, you let businesses do what they do. Because social liberalism and economic liberalism and corporations go hand in hand. Because I don't think there's a better transmitter of liberal policy than the corporation. The corporation protects the self-expression of these various oppressed groups. But the cishet white male guy? Nah, fuck him. We as a corporation have a social responsibility to correct historical injustices by stiffing this poor guy out of a job. This is why I'm not a member of the Republican Party, because they keep sucking the cocks of these businesses that do this exact thing. In light of recent events that I won't discuss because they've been discussed in so much detail that I have nothing else to add, a lot of people are saying that free speech is not consequence-free speech. Let that sink in for a bit, especially who it's coming from. Considering who it's coming from, it seems a bit silly, don't you think? Because you're never going to get to agree with these people that, well, fuck hate is distributing pederast literature to children in Russia. Well, they have their free speech, but they should be put in a gulag. Hey, free speech and consequence-free speech. Using this hypothetical example under their rules, fuck hate is expressing their free speech, but they've suffered consequences for their speech, and now they are no longer free. At this point that you bring this up, they change the rules. They say, well, hate speech isn't free speech. The framers of the Constitution never said anything about being offensive. Great. Along with dysgenic breeding, I now have something else that people will repeat back at me. Self-expression. Self-expression is bad, we know. Yeah, well, guess what? It all boils down to feelings with these people. I know it's cliche, but it's really true. If you boil down the essence of what they're arguing, it's all about feelings. These weird protected groups that they have, that they designate for some reason, you can't hurt their feelings under any circumstances whatsoever. Did you know that if you type in a tag when you're uploading your YouTube videos, if you type in homophobia, the suggested tag is homophobia and in parentheses, crime type? These people think that being scared of gay people is a crime. For this reason, I'm very surprised as to why YouTube hasn't taken down this documentary yet about HIV called The Gift. It's about people who intentionally seek out the HIV virus. HIV virus ATM machine. I know it's redundant, but I don't feel like going back and fixing it. But that's all I'll say about it. If you want to seek it out, look up HIV/AIDS documentary, and it should be the first result on YouTube. And that's all I'll say about it because, according to YouTube, I'm committing a crime. So let's move on. But the idea that free speech is not consequence free speech is the most odious thing I've ever heard. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but my memory is failing me right now. But I don't feel bad because memory in the mind of the American does not exist. Americans don't have memory. They really don't. That's why they always tell people never forget 9/11. Because they would probably fucking forget about it if they weren't constantly reminded. If you're bad at remembering and don't pay close attention to this YouTube channel, I don't see why you wouldn't. If you're listening to this, you probably do, but I debuted a new show, Tumblristas, which is named after the Facebook page that I run, and it's quite related to the content that I post on there. The only difference between the page and the show is that I actually give commentary, and unlike this show, I actually script Tumblristas out a little bit. Last episode was short, the first episode was short, but this one is going to be longer because I'm going to be doing a lot more commentary and a lot more screenshots. I was going to move Tumblristas to Tuesday and call it Tumblristas Tuesday, but I tried that the first week I did it, and I just don't like doing that because I like the Tuesday time slot for this show because it's still early in the week and people are looking for something to fill the time until the weekend, because once you upload on Thursday, that's way too close to Friday, and nobody gives a shit about you at that point. So a mistake on my part in terms of maximizing my reach, but you know what? I learned from that mistake, and I'm not going to repeat it. And I said in a comment reply that this year on this show I was going to try to keep the mood lighter, but maybe I'll try that again next week, because I don't think I kept the mood sufficiently light to my liking, but oh well. You move on. This isn't related to anything, but when I post these screenshots of these terrible people doing terrible things, like the fat positive people or the fat spiration people, there's always like, well, they'd be cute if, or I'd have sex with them, or if I'm posting some guy about how he's like, oh, I'm gay and I like to drink piss off of bathroom floors. There's always somebody like, oh, as a blankety blank, I am opposed to blankety blank. It's like, am I talking about you? Shut up. I didn't ask for your fucking opinion. This attitude towards exceptions seems to be a problem exclusive to English-speaking regions, because when we are taught grammar, when we are taught basic sentence structure, we are taught the rules of English. But then we are taught that paying attention to the exception to these rules is much more important than the rules themselves. This is important because language is the root of all opinion. It's the root of all interaction. So when we are confronted with an alarming amount of degeneracy or deviancy, the average person just writes it off as, well, I'm not like that, therefore it's not a problem. When I post screenshots to Tumblristas, this is a very common refrain that I see. Well, as a blank, I'm not like that. Or, as a blank, I find this disgusting. Why can't it just be, I find this disgusting? You're trying to justify that behavior, or that behavior which that group of people generally tends to exhibit. And I understand why people respond this way. I get it. People see a commonality between what is being exposed and themselves, so they feel the need to reiterate, I'm not like that. No one likes having a mirror turned on themselves. But this is a non-issue. I wouldn't even be talking about this if people would stop seeing exceptions as something to take notice of. Something that you do not pay much attention to. Because an exception is just that. It's exceptional. We do not deal with the exceptional in daily life. We deal with the average. The lowest common denominator. And this is why mass media is so dangerous, because it presents the exceptional as the ordinary. It presents ideas to people that never had any idea that those things existed prior to it being presented to them. But again, it would not matter. The manipulation that mass media performs on individuals, on society, it wouldn't matter if society didn't care about the exceptions. Talk to the average person. Find out what they think about Pope Francis. They generally think positively of him, at least from the people that I've talked to. They say, oh, he's a good pope. When in reality, I see many commonalities between him and the people that run the Tumblr blogs who tag their posts with all this shit, and that's how I find them. If he were born any later, he'd be one of those people. He would undergo hormone therapy. He'd be a faith healer for the Unitarian Universalist Church. But nobody knows that because it's not presented to them by any authority. It's not presented to them through TV, through mainstream internet news outlets, through local newspapers. None of it. Not radio, not talk radio, save for maybe Michael Savage, who called him Pope Stalin or something. No, Lenin's Pope. Lenin's Pope is what he called him, but I'm calling him Pope SJW. People view him as an exception when in reality he's not. And this is a bit of a different issue, but he's not any different than the rest of the Catholic leadership. Did you know that Notre Dame Seminary School, its nickname is Notre Flame because they're notorious for the amount of buggery that goes on? I'm about to read from killingthebuddha.com an article called Confessions of an Ex-Seminarian. It says, someone would be arrested if this happened today. A group of men take a 16-year-old boy to a room to show him a hardcore film featuring a woman copulating with a German Shepherd dog. It happened in 1975 at St. Gregory. It was the first stag film I ever saw. I don't think Pope Francis falls very far from this tree. And this is to say nothing of the common Catholic. I realize that they have nothing to do with this. But I do find it odd that priests are required to be celibate. And they use the cloak of celibacy to do all of this shit. Another part of this article says, I was a student at Covington Latin School in 1970 through 1974 when Bierman was the school counselor. He also taught religion. His class featured a kind of madness so blatant that the faculty could have ignored it only by choice. Bierman told us that women sometimes don't achieve orgasm during intercourse. In such cases, masturbation was permissible with the blessing of the church. This was, in fact, a misrepresentation. Holy Mother Church doesn't condone masturbation. At no time, no how. Even so, Bierman's lecture on the art of pleasuring one's spouse might have been useful information for men closer to marriageable age, but we were 12 years old. He told us priests wore cassocks during confession in order to conceal their erections. This was back when priests still wore cassocks, essentially black gowns, and when Catholics still went to confession. He told us, 70% of all boys have homosexual experiences. When it happens to you, don't be upset. When I was 15, Bierman took a friend and me to see The Exorcist. Although the movie was restricted to adults, he had no trouble getting us in. That night, we stayed at his rectory, and he took my friend into his room for private counseling and touching. These are the two parts that I wanted to read, but the article has some problems. He seems to be sensitive, the author of this article, to the fact that people point out that, well, these priests aren't molesting girls. What can we gather from this? And one more bit that I forgot to read. This comes before the paragraphs that I just read. The Reverend Earl Bierman, for example, pronounced wedding vows upon Richie, a 13-year-old boy, while sodomizing him in a motel. Again, if Pope SJW were born much later, he would probably be commenting on my page saying how he doesn't see a problem with this. So there's some bits about religion, because I have a lot of religion questions to answer. This one comes from Dustin, and he sent this a few weeks ago, and I've neglected to answer it for the last couple of weeks, so here we go. My question has to do with the procedure of circumcision. Over the past few weeks, I've seen something I never even knew existed. People who are against the practice of circumcising their children. This seemed very odd to me, and I mostly found this idea in the ones who frequent the men's rights activist pages on Facebook. After doing research on a topic I thought I would never have to research and having my eyes open during a previous episode of CFR where you discuss rights and how they lead to entitlement, which in turn leads to narcissism, I came to the conclusion that these kinds of people who are so vehemently against the procedure and call it mutilation turn a blind eye to the truth, both cultural and scientific. I think there's a reason Abraham used it, and I think circumcision should still be done today. What are your thoughts on it? To first attack this from the men's rights angle, I do get it, that it is a bit fucked up from a modern standpoint to perform an invasive procedure on an infant without anesthesia. And they also like to bring up the issue of choice in the matter. Babies don't have a choice whether or not their foreskins get cut off. But you could go down the slippery slope with that because children are not supposed to have agency. They are not capable of making their own decisions. While I don't entirely agree with how they get to the conclusion that circumcision is bad, I respect it a hell of a lot more than the other side of the anti-circumcision argument, which seems to come from people who are all, "Ma dick, it feels better, ma dick." And Abraham did have a good reason to do what he did because God told him, "You're going to do this as a signal that you are in agreement with me." So if we're going to argue this from the Old Testament perspective, then there is a good argument to be made for circumcision. But on the other hand, there are good arguments to be made from a New Testament perspective. This is from StopCirc.com, a biased source, but it does tell the story of it pretty well. In Luke 2:21, Jesus' circumcision is mentioned. The new covenant began on this day of his resurrection, and thus all Jews were bound to obey the old covenant until then. This is the first reason for Christ's circumcision. He was born under the Old Testament covenant, and his parents were obedient. But the second reason, which transcends the cultural, is even more significant. The Bible teaches that Christ's circumcision was the starting point of his shedding of blood for humanity, and that not only did he do so to identify with all those who had suffered under this grievous burden, but he did it also as a substitution for all the babies that would be born after the new covenant. And then it goes on to explain how there was a conflict between the Old Covenant Jews who wanted to become a part of the New Covenant and those born into the New Covenant, i.e., those who are circumcised and those who are uncircumcised. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17, it says, "As God has called each man in this manner, let him walk. And thus I command in all the churches. Was any man called in the circumcision? Let him not try to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in the uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let each man remain in that condition in which he was called." So this was during a time when there still existed Jews that were born during the Old Covenant and lived long enough to see the New Covenant. So given my Christian background, if I were to have a son, I would not get him circumcised for these reasons, but it's not as if you will be denied the kingdom of God if you are. But from a practical, non-spiritual perspective, back when the Old Testament was written, sanitation was not what it is now. So it was harder to keep clean and harder to keep yourself from disease, which is why there are rules against pork and shellfish. There wasn't in existence the proper refrigeration methods that we have now. I like to use the hypothetical example of a poor illiterate farmer being told about why he shouldn't eat pork or shellfish. Because if you're some nerd going up to him back then and saying, "Hey, don't eat that. That has tiny little microscopic things that if you ingest them, they'll kill you." And you'll be like, "What the fuck? I don't see it. That's stupid." "No, it doesn't. Look, it's right there. I see the pork." Alternatively, you could say to him, "God, who loves you dearly, who created all of these wonderful things, doesn't want you to do this." The poor illiterate farmer is going to be like, "Okay, I'll go with God, because I can't see him anyway." Dustin had another question regarding my favorite books of the Bible, what my favorite Old Testament book is, and what my favorite New Testament book is. My favorite Old Testament book is Proverbs because its observations on human nature are unlike anything that I've ever read. My favorite book of the New Testament is Revelation because I have doomsday fantasies and I crave release. Though Brother Nathaniel does point out the people that like to use Revelation are these very good businessmen that sell this idea of a heaven being established on earth and Israel needs to be intact for that to happen, and it just promotes moral laziness, like he says. Next question is from John. I recently started regularly going to church. I've been once to one across the street from my apartment, and I'm looking forward to going again. I felt revitalized, and I loved being able to sit in a room and worship God with people that looked, and more importantly, believed like me. So far, I have no complaints about the church, although we didn't talk much about Scripture like I would have liked. I'm wondering what you think about Catholicism versus Protestantism. Catholicism is attractive to me because of its more or less unbroken connection as the oldest church of Jesus Christ, but at the same time, I am put off by the level of worship of Mary and the saints. In addition, I am put off by the amount of time they seem to spend attacking Protestant churches. Protestant churches, on the other hand, lack the unity that Catholicism and also has all the weird churches like the Pentecostals that do the weird speaking in tongues thing. The church I went to was Presbyterian and they were very friendly and welcoming without being high pressure like Mormons are. And I really enjoyed the feeling I got from attending the church. I just don't want to end up investing myself in a church that turns out to be, to borrow some TRS terminology, the right stuff if you're unfamiliar, totally dildo like some churches have become. What advice would you give to someone who is trying to find the right church in their life? I don't talk about what I was brought up in much, but I was brought up in these non-denominational churches that weren't officially part of anything, or at least they didn't advertise themselves as being a part of any brand of church, and they weren't under the banner of, like you said, Presbyterian or Mormon, which is a heresy, but we'll get into that later. So with that in mind, understand that I'm not entirely familiar with things like Presbyterian or Episcopalian, but from what I've gathered in my experience, you want to be a part of a church that seems completely uninterested in worldly things. Churches that are interested in hopping from trend to trend and being like, hey, Christians can be cool too, avoid that completely. Basically, the more traditionalist a church prides itself on being, the better off it is going to be. So with that in mind, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they are heavily traditionalist and they make a case that we are the truest church that Christ envisioned. And I haven't read up on it enough, but they have Mount Athos, which is where a lot of the Christian monasteries are, and they still go off of Byzantine time. The existence of that place is proof that empires never really die. They leave some remnant of themselves, even if they are nowhere near what they were, but that's another point. I stated my problems with Catholicism earlier on in this episode, and yeah, I do not like the fact that their priests are supposed to be celibate because that invites a lot of corruption, as we've exposed here today. Maybe I'm just ignorant of the realities of what is being taught, but in my mind, wouldn't you want God's most able leaders allegedly to go forth and multiply the most? But another piece of advice that I would give is to make sure that the pastor or the priest is a cis-het white male, or at least, at very least, a cis-het male. Because if the leader of a church is anything but a cis-het male, they are not biblical. And that would be indicative of their rebelliousness against God. So that about does it for the advice that I have, because if they aren't traditional, if they aren't biblical, then they're trying to be cool and edgy and all this other shit that'll be here today, gone tomorrow, and the church might go away, but those people, they will burn in hell. Next up is from Han. First of all, I'd like to thank you for helping me rekindling my faith in God, as I believe it is quite easy to lose sight of such important things in today's world. But on to the question. Do you believe people would be happier as a whole if more of them had a much more firm set of values and morals instead of being swayed and controlled by things like passing trends and superficial things? Do you think it could be possible for more people to return to more firm family values instead of allowing the misinformed populace to decide what is right for you and your family? I've always been a big advocate of choosing a set of values and adhering to them despite what the world thinks of them. And those values should be informed by a higher power, something greater than what the world has to offer. The problem aren't the trends in and of themselves. The problem is that the people who adopt these trends and assign greater meaning to them than what actually exists, they wouldn't do this if they had a moral foundation. The trends right now seem to favor miscreants and repurposing them in the eyes of the general population as misunderstood heroes, and why don't you just accept them? They're just being who they are, these kind of mantras that are justifying self-expression in and of itself as a good thing. Miscreants have existed in every culture, throughout time. So, given that they will always exist, you can't be terribly worried about them. You can only worry about them if there is no existing social structure to keep them in check. And in America, at the very least, it doesn't exist. We seem to be in agreement that God is the best check that you could put in place against the incessant attacks that the modern world constantly places upon us. But given that we live in a weak culture that favors feelings over truth, God is abandoned. In favor of what? God is abandoned in favor of self-indulgence. The family unit and the values that spring up from that would appear to be a good check against the modern world as well. But if that family is not a godly family, then it's just as worthless as these trends people worship. In fact, families become victim to these trends. Families often encourage their daughters to go on birth control. They do not prevent their sons from having children out of wedlock. And even if the family does the right things for the right reasons, they send their children off to college, completely oblivious of what the university experience will do to those children. As a famous terrorist once said, people will always go with the strong horse over the weak horse, every time. And where is the strong horse in our culture? There is none. So, self-indulgence and self-expression and indulging the senses, that seems like the strong horse by comparison, by default. To these people who think that pleasure, happiness is the most important thing in life, of course they're going to say, God's just an evil bigot, murderer, homophobe, completely dancing around the subject, which is, they are rejecting God because they like their moral decadence. The fact that they assign worldly values to God as a reason to reject Him is just proof that, yes, they do follow trends and prevailing attitudes. That is their God. They prefer the temporary over the eternal. They reject the only reliable means by which to organize people throughout the history of mankind. This question was submitted anonymously through Ask FM. What do you make of the Tumblr type self-harming? It's a touchy subject, but is this some fucked up way of acknowledging that their lifestyle just isn't right? What are your general thoughts? People like to support and advocate for the rights of crazy people through their words. And that is very bad because it shows that they have a bad heart. But the fact that the Tumblr type self-harm is the fact that they do live in isolation. They do live loveless, horrible lives. They have the backing of the general population, but they don't have them in practice, only in theory. The only people that can truly stand being around trans feminist social justice advocates are other trans feminist social justice advocates. Because if you spent time around any one of those people, not together, just any one of those groups of people, you will realize that they are caustic, that they are such a drain to be around, that death seems preferable than to spend time around them. But on the other hand, maybe the general population is becoming so crazy in and of themselves that they too are caustic personality types. We know that birds of a feather flock together. We don't have to repeat that over and over again, like they seem to, because they seem to be convincing themselves of something. Very desperately trying to convince themselves of something. But why do they cut themselves? Again, they live loveless, empty lives. People who have at least one healthy relationship in their life don't resort to this kind of behavior. I don't like the fact that Tumblr types cut themselves. I don't like the fact that they self-mutilate in more ways than one, but I don't like it. I don't want them to. It's very sad that they don't have any meaningful relationships that they can cling themselves to. To use that relationship as a reason not to go off the deep end. But we can't ignore the fact that their horrible personalities often lead them to where they are, in their lonely lives, in their desolate, horrible lives. So my sympathy only goes to a certain extent. Next up from Shane. I decided to ask a question on Facebook instead of email for whatever reason. I came to show you this video. If you cannot see it for some reason, it is a black father telling the camera that his son isn't a gangbanger and slaps his son and basically disciplines his son out of being a thug. What do you think of this? Personally, I think if all black people disciplined like this, their community would be better. You can argue either way using this video because, on one hand, this kid actually has a father, a patriarch in his life, which is increasingly rare in black America, that a black child has a father. And not just a father, but a father that is active in raising his child. I think a lot of us blame, for good reason, black America's dysfunction on the fact that a lot of black kids are raised by single mothers. I'm not quite sure of the percentage, but it is alarmingly high. And I don't think that there's any debate because there's social science research out there that shows that the prison population is overwhelmingly single mother raised. I remember during the Adrian Peterson child abuse scandal, Charles Barkley came out and said, look, beating your child is a part of Southern black culture. With this in mind, there is some research to support the fact that beating your child will cause them to have behavioral problems later in life. I remember having this informal debate with this black guy about the effectiveness of scared straight programs, and he said that if he were in that situation, he would not react well to it. He would just say, oh shit, is this what's out there for me as a black kid? Well then, fuck, I guess I'm resigned to this. And what we're talking about are these programs where you send kids to prison for a day or two and they get yelled at by prisoners, and that's supposedly supposed to put them on track and not want to go to jail. I never so severely misbehaved as a child that I needed to be sent to one of these things, but in my mind, if I were sent to one of these things, I would be scared by it. I would be scared into good behavior, at least temporarily, because I wouldn't want to go to jail. But the guy I was talking to, because a lot of the prison population is black, he said he would see these people as his eventual future, and it would make him resign to the fact that he would end up in jail, rather than serving as a negative example of how not to be. This is obviously a narrow set of opinions because it just came from one person, so you don't want to draw any grander conclusions from that. But to me, those programs would make a better solution than just getting the shit beat out of you. But blacks aren't as future-oriented as other people, so maybe they cannot fathom that. Like, oh, I can do something to avoid going to jail. So with regard to this video, I think that it comes out on the wash. I mean, evidence suggests that beating your child is not the way to go, but at the very least, this kid has a dad. And this dad finds thug culture distasteful, which any decent person should. Next question from Robert. I'd like to ask for a bit of advice. I've come to the point in my high school career where kids of my age are supposed to start applying and getting ready for college. But I've decided against going to college. Instead, I plan on going into the trades and possibly becoming an electrician. The problem is my parents. They both completely forbid me from doing anything other than going to college after high school. They say that I must at least get a degree, and I owe them that much. And I'm stuck. On one hand, I really don't want to waste time and money going to college when I'd much rather spend time and money doing something worthwhile. But on the other hand, my parents have done so much for me, having paid for my education since I was 6. I already feel guilty for arguing with them about it and don't want to disappoint my parents. What should I do? Did you ever experience anything like this when you were? I think you should do both, because having a good relationship with your parents that is ongoing is incredibly important. And your parents, like a lot of parents, don't have a lot of imagination with regard to the realities of academia and credentials, because you're going to go a lot farther having a universally applicable skill like being an electrician than you would having a humanities degree. So I think you could satisfy them by going to community college and taking bullshit prerequisite classes that you don't have to put much effort into. And you could present it to them like this: look, I'm going to be taking prerequisite classes that have nothing to do with what I eventually want to do, and I can do it cheaper in this venue. At community college, almost every class you take there is boilerplate 101 material. They teach it the same way at the community college level as they do at the university level. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper to do it at the community college level. But community college, junior college, whatever you want to call it, has the advantage of offering things like welding and HVAC repair. So if it's possible using the junior college, community college path, do both at the same time. And by the time that you have your credentials in order to become an electrician, then you get the job and you say, hey, look, I have this well-paying job. I can support myself now. I'm not going to get a degree because this job is much more well-paying than anything that I could get with any sort of four-year degree. And I will always be employed because my skills will never be not in demand. And if you think that'll be too time-consuming or the logistics don't work out with that for whatever reason, ask your parents, what would you rather have me do? And if they say, oh, well, we just want you to get a degree, ask them what? In what? If they want you to get a humanities degree, or if they say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what you get a degree in as long as you say no. If I'm going to spend this much time and money, I want something that will give me a useful skill that will never be not in demand. Because being an electrician, being a mechanic, being an HVAC repairman, that stuff will never go away. And the same thing applies with something you do have to get a degree in, like engineering. Going into the trades like you want to do will equip you for life far better than a humanities degree would. But, on the other hand, things like engineering you can only study in college. Computer programming is something that's not going to go away either. So if you're at all adept at any of the STEM fields, then I recommend that you do that to both satisfy your parents and actually get a decent skill set that won't leave you homeless in however many years before companies decide that employing social media consultants is a waste of time and money. So you have a couple of options, and probably more options than you were aware of before you listened to this. But I'm sure that if you put delicately for your parents what I just put before you on this show, I think they will understand a little bit better your issue with academia. So best of luck to you in figuring this out for yourself, because I think you are absolutely in the right. It is much better to learn something that is useful rather than learning something that is socially prestigious, because the middle class doesn't exist anymore. There are fewer and fewer jobs out there for those who want to be cerebral and intellectual and get humanities degrees, even though there's nothing intellectual or cerebral about those things anymore. There's the Law School Lemmings blog that shows the epidemic of unemployed lawyers and the fact that all of these people are bragging about going to law school despite the fact that they did not get into one of the top law schools. Because if you do not get into one of those top law schools, you're better off not going at all. There's simply no more room for basic mediocre people anymore, for better or for worse. You either have to be highly skilled and highly universal in your skills, or you have to be willing to put in some sweat into your work. A humanities degree just puts you in limbo. You're neither one of those things. And with that, I am out of questions for this week. So if you would like to hear your question answered next week, email me at commonfilth@commonfilth.com. I read them and I do research into my answers if I need to do so. And if it takes me a while to get to your questions, I do get to them eventually if you send them to my email. If you send them anywhere else, it'll be a while before I see them. If you're listening in this far, I would like to thank you for doing so. And if you like what you hear and you would like to support what I do on this show, you can go to the Bandcamp link below, commonfilthradio.bandcamp.com, and Buy Common Filth Radio, the best of 2014. It's $2, and if you want to pay more, you can do that. Also, I have the Amazon affiliate marketing still going, so if you click that link below, it lets Amazon know where you came from, and whatever you decide to purchase after clicking that link, they give a percentage of your total purchase to me at no additional cost to you. So that just about does it for this week of Common Filth Radio. I got a new episode of Tumblristas coming out on Thursday, and it should be every Thursday for quite some time. So I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you're looking forward to it as well, and I hope you enjoy it. So thank you for listening, and I will see you guys next week.